we'll get started. We have a wonderful crowd, which we really appreciate. We appreciate this vote of confidence, not only in Mr. Murch's work, but also in the archives. Many of you are acquainted with the archives, but we're always looking for ideas of things that you might be interested in seeing. So please provide feedback on the events you attend and don't attend as well. If there's something else you'd like to see us put on, every now and then we can get some money thrown our way to help put some of these events on and get organized. We want to be really active in the community and be out there, be in Fort Kent and Madawaska and Van Buren and so forth, but we love bringing the community here as we're doing tonight. So again, thank you for being here. I think we're in for a treat. And I mean, just looking at this book, you know we are. There are a lot of stories and a lot of work in here, and I'm not sure that an hour or a few hours would do justice to Mr. Murch's work, but he'll try, and we'll give him the floor in just a minute. So I'll provide an introduction to Mr. Murch, who is a retired state environmental regulator and a 13th generation Maine. Been working on that one. He's a descendant of many early settlers of both Acadia and Quebec, and is also a multiple Mayflower descendant, and he knows a thing or two about that as well from his other work. So having published books on both his paternal and maternal ancestries, Dana is now working on the definitive genealogy and history of the entire Murch family of Maine, whose roots have been traced back to 17th century Devonshire, I think I got that right, England, and he currently resides with his wife Meredith in Belfast. Now this book, as he'll tell you much more eloquently in just a few minutes, is written in the vein of Leo Sears' classic 1985 work, Matawascan Heritage, which we have somewhere along the boards here, one of many classic works that we do have, and we hope that you will consider coming back to explore all these great resources if you haven't already. Everything you see around you here in the bookshelves are genealogies or family histories, a lot of great church registers that are essential for doing research on local families. So really it's an impressive collection. We would say it's unmatched, although Caribou has a really lovely library as well. So if you're closer to Caribou, we would totally understand, but we have a lot here as well to offer to researchers. So this, of course, is a history not only of Daniel F. Thibodeau and Rebecca Jandreau, but associated lines, family lines, and we'll get a glimpse of those family lines in just a moment. So it's really vast, and I was sharing with Mr. Murch earlier, the wonderful thing here is that, for one thing, it's a wonderful slice of St. Francis history and Valley history. It's not focused on a single family, as you can tell, right? There are a lot of lines that are included in here. And it's really a snapshot of family connections in the Valley in a way that's, in my view, really unmatched by any other work in our library. So it's really a pleasure to be able to turn the figurative microphone over to Mr. Murch tonight. And I trust we'll be able to have a Q&A session at the end. So make sure you make mental notes of your questions. And luckily we have a wonderful PowerPoint presentation to accompany it. So please join me in welcoming Dana Murch.
So as Patrick said, I'm Dana Murch. I was born at Carey Medical Center in Caribou in 1952, so I'll give away my age. My father's family is from the coast of Maine, originally from immigrants from Devonshire. And I'd gotten interested in my father's ancestry some time ago, and that was the subject of my first book, which was My Murch Line. And while researching that, I discovered that my parents were multiple cousins and had no idea. So my father, after World War II, went to work for a New England telephone company and was working out of Limestone. From there, he went to Fort Kent to cut the Fort Kent Telephone Company over to New England Telephone, so you could actually pick up a phone in the valley and call someone outside of the valley. Imagine that. My mother, who was born in St. Francis, was a switchboard operator for Fort Kent Telephone, and that's how they met. And I decided then to do my mother's ancestry and had no idea what I was getting into. Because I don't know about you, but I didn't learn Canadian history in school. I didn't learn anything about the St. John Valley in school either. So the fun part for me was actually learning all of that history and putting my ancestors in the context of that history, which is not an easy task. And for those of you who do genealogy, I encourage you to do both your paternal line, which most ancestries are, but also your maternal line. Because in my case, I would never have known that I was a multiple Mayflower descendant if I didn't track all the women. So you're missing half of the genealogy if you don't do the women in your history. This is the 1920 wedding photo of my grandparents. And I'm not a French speaker, so there'll be decided English accent to all these French words. There are a few that I'll try, but not too many. But my grandparents, Daniel Thibodeau and Rebecca Jandreau, the story is that my grandfather was a very short man, so he got to sit for the photograph, which I guess was fairly common. This is a 5-generation ancestry chart of my grandfather. And the print is very small, so you don't need to focus on it, but there are a whole bunch of lines here, names here, that you will recognize. Cyr, Ayotte, Gilbert, Valancourt, Dubé, Nadeau, Michaud, and the same with my grandmother, because my grandparents were related a gazillion ways to Sunday, which is, I think, pretty common for people who live in the valley. So there's Michaud, there's Ouellette, there's Dubé, so familiar names. I'm going to start by talking about the Thibodeau family, then the Jandreau family, and then a whole number of related families that the Thibodeaus and the Jandreaus married into. And along the way, you'll get 400 years of history, and hopefully some of which, I'm sure some of which you know, hopefully some of which you don't know. And you'll get a sense of the information that's available, because it is truly amazing for people like me who spent years researching New England families, where there can be 100-year gaps in births, marriages, and the like. Having the kind of information that's available on Acadian and Quebec families is just amazing. So this is my primary Thibodeau line through 9 generations to my grandfather at the bottom, Daniel Frederick Thibodeau. You'll recognize, for those of you with Acadian ancestry, you'll recognize a number of these names. Thériault, Hébert, LeBlanc, Babin. Those are all old Acadian names. So we begin with Pierre Thibodeau, the first Thibodeau to settle in Acadia. He was 23 years old when he arrived at Port Royal, which is now Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia, in 1654 on a 3-year indenture. Most people who came who weren't tradesmen didn't have the money to pay for their passage. So they actually, in France, signed a contract with someone in Acadia or in Quebec to work for them to pay off the cost of their passage. A typical indenture in Acadia and Quebec was 3 years. In colonial Massachusetts, it was often 7 years. But at the end of that time, you were free and could make your way in the world. By 1660, Pierre had served out his indenture and had married the 17-year-old daughter of immigrants who had arrived in 1635. She was a Thériault. Pierre then received a grant of land at Round Hill, located about 6 miles up the Annapolis River, where he built a farm, a grist mill, and a water-powered sawmill. Pierre and his family were listed in the first census of Acadia in 1671. For those of you who do New England research, I mean, the first census in the United States was after the Revolutionary War and we were a country in 1790. This is a census naming everyone who lived in Acadia in 1671. What's also useful is that married women kept their maiden names, which is the only way you could track them. In the census, it lists the children by name, the livestock, and the amount of land under cultivation. Pierre and Jean Thériault had 16 children and 159 grandchildren. All 16 children lived to marry, and they listed here with their spouses. My grandfather was descended from two of those, and they're the ones that are in bold, Marie there and Jean there. Pierre was 58 years old when his last child was born. His wife was either pregnant or nursing for at least 30 consecutive years, beginning when she was 17 years old. Pierre Thibodeau died on Christmas Day, 1704, at the age of 73, and was buried the following day. This is his burial record. During his life, Pierre was at various times a farmer, a colonizer, a miller, a fur trader, and a sawyer. His wife, Jean Thériault, outlived her husband by 22 years and died in December of 1726 at the age of 83 after 16 children. She was buried at Port Royal on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is December 8th, and this is her burial. There's a memorial plaque to Pierre near the site of his gristmill and sawmill at Round Hill, which is just up the river from Annapolis Royal. This is a map of New France and Acadia. With the treaty ending Queen Anne's War in 1713, which is one of the seemingly interminable French and Indian wars, France ceded control of Acadia, Hudson's Bay, and Newfoundland to Great Britain. France retained control only of Quebec, Cape Breton Island, and what is now Prince Edward Island. So the second and third generations of the Thibodeau family were British subjects, and were French subjects, if you will. In 1754, the final French and Indian War began. Soon, British concerns about an Acadian alliance with the French led to what's known as Le Grand Dérangement, or the Great Upheaval, during which the majority of the French Acadians were either deported or became refugees, and many families were separated. The effect on the Acadian community was devastating, and only a few native Acadians remained in Nova Scotia after the end of the last French and Indian War in 1763. Among the families who were affected by the Great Upheaval was that of Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, the grandson of the immigrant Pierre. After refusing to swear allegiance to the King of England, Jean-Baptiste and his family were deported to Boston. After the end of the war, the family was granted passage to Quebec, and by 1768, they were settled on the lower St. John River near present-day Fredericton, New Brunswick, which at the time was still part of Acadia. Basically, everything that wasn't part of Quebec along the St. Lawrence River was called Acadia. Then came the Revolutionary War. Following the end of that war, in 1783, Great Britain created the province of New Brunswick from the northern part of Acadia as the new home for loyalists who were displaced from the American colonies. I mean, there was literally a flotilla of ships that left New York City full of loyalists who went to both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau didn't have a deed. He was a squatter, as were all the other Acadians in the Fredericton area at the time. Faced with eviction as a squatter, Jean-Baptiste, who was then 84 years old, moved his family to the Madawaska Territory, located above Grand Falls on the Upper St. John River, where he and his son were among the earliest settlers. And they actually got plots of land from Great Britain. This is 1790. The United States is now a country, but neither the eastern border nor the northern border of Maine had been established. Both countries, both America and Great Britain, claimed both sides, and the British actually granted deeds to land on both sides. So that is Jean-Baptiste the father, and across the river, in what is now New Brunswick, is Jean-Baptiste the son. By 1833, sixth-generation descendant Joseph David Thibodeau was married and living at the Green River back settlement on the north bank of the St. John River, which is now in New Brunswick. And that year, the provincial government of New Brunswick conducted a census of the communities on both sides of the river. The census was conducted to ascertain the need for government assistance due to a series of bad harvests that had resulted in near starvation conditions in the area. In the census of 1833, Joseph David Thibodeau was listed as a head of household with a family consisting of his wife and 8 children. For livestock, they had 2 horses, 3 cows, 2 young cattle, 8 sheep, and 4 pigs. That year, they cut 10 tons of hay and sowed various crops, including wheat, oats, peas, and potatoes, that did not produce any recorded yield. The family was listed in the census as, quote, requiring almost immediate relief. And I don't know what kind of relief the government provided. I couldn't find any record of that. I don't know if you know. In 1842, the northern and eastern boundaries between Maine and New Brunswick were finally settled in a treaty. In northern Aroostook County, the border became the St. John River, effectively splitting the Madawaska settlement in 2. And families that had lived in the area for more than 50 years, all of a sudden, were in 2 different countries. Not that it mattered at the time, you just got in a boat and went across, but it matters today. The family of Joseph David Thibodeau was now part of the San Basile settlement, which is in New Brunswick, and that's a photo of I think it's a reproduction of the original chapel that was there.
It's still there today. Or the last time I was there. It was still there the last time I was there.
Okay. Ailey Thibodeau, the 7th child of Joseph David Thibodeau and his wife Celeste Sear, was born in 1828 at San Basile, on what would become a Canadian side of the St. John River. In 1850, Ailey married Second Gilbert, who was from the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. This is their marriage record. Ailey and Second were recorded in the 1850 census for Township 17, Range 9, now St. Francis, where Ailey was reportedly the first settler. I haven't verified that, but that's in print. So, and for those of you doing research, all of the census takers were English speakers. So they basically wrote what they heard phonetically. And you can find like gazillion spellings of these names in the census. And there were times when I had to sit and go through the microfilm of each page of the census, knowing who the children were to figure out which was the right family. And that's a photograph of Ailey Thibodeau, 1855, 1860, maybe. Ailey died at St. Francis in 1908 at the age of 80. The cause of death was listed as old age.
Yes.
His wife, Seconde Gilbert, died at St. Francis in 1910 at the age of 77. The cause of death, old age. Their eldest son, Frederick Thibodeau, was born at St. Francis in 1855. He married Natalie Nadeau, and that's an undated photograph. They look to be in their late 40s, 50s, something like that. This is a memorial card for Fred Thibodeau, who died in 1928. And that's the gravestones of Fred and his wife, Natalie Nadeau, at St. Charles Catholic Cemetery in St. Francis. And finally, my grandfather, Daniel Frederick Thibodeau. And someone else, you have a great pronunciation of these names, so I'll have to talk to you afterwards. He was born in St. Francis in 1892, the 8th of 11 children. In 1917, Daniel Thibodeau registered for the World War I draft. He was 24 years old and single. He was subsequently inducted into the U.S. Army and served for 7 months as a mechanic at Camp Devens in Massachusetts. And thanks to my cousin June, this is the handwritten note from the parish priest of the marriage of my grandparents. And you've seen the wedding photo. That was my grandparents' house, which unfortunately burned a couple of years ago. It was on the main drag, as we say, between St. John and St. Francis Village. I don't know who those people are. My guess is they're either my mother and one of her sisters, or they're both her sisters. I think so. Yeah. This is a photo probably taken by my grandmother of the family. That's my grandfather. Picking potatoes at the farm of Richard Libby in Limestone during World War II. My oldest uncle, Lallman, was already in the service and was serving in France. That's my mother.
Where's Valmont there?
Excuse me?
Valmont, he's got to be there.
He was in France.
Oh, he was in the service.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Trifley right there.
Trifley.
That's my grandfather's obituary. He died in 1959. I was 7 years old, so I barely remember him. He died from pneumonia and Parkinson's disease, which I don't think any of us knew until I found the death record. And my grandmother's obituary, she died in 1996 at the age of 96 from a heart attack. The gravestone at the new St. Francis Cemetery, which is actually close to the house that they had. In 1984, the Thibodeau family held a reunion commemorating the 280th anniversary of the death of the immigrant, Pierre Thibodeau. The Maine State Legislature issued a proclamation recognizing this reunion. Recognize a few. There's John Martin. Jerry Connolly was president of the Senate at the time. Ed Pert was the longtime clerk of the house. Now what's interesting about these, many families had reunions, and many of those families got these legislative proclamations issued. And when I went to the state law library to get a copy, they said, well, the legislature didn't keep copies. They gave the original to the family. Luckily, many of those families have published genealogies and family reunion books and included copies. And the only place that has most of those is here, which is why I came here multiple times to find these. So that was great. And at the time of the reunion, the family placed a monument at the Acadian Landing Historic Site in St. David. You go to the St. David Church and then drive to the river, and it's a beautiful place if you haven't been there. Now we'll do the Jandreaus. Pierre Jandreau was born in 1633 on the French island of Ile de Lion. He immigrated to Quebec in 1656 and worked his 3-year indenture for a local merchant before becoming a farmer, a mason, and a fur trader. In 1663, Pierre Jandreau married 30-year-old Marie-Jeanne Garnier, a widow with 3 young children who was also a native of Ile de Lion, France. Over the next 150 years, the surname ancestors of my grandmother, Rebecca Jandreau, lived at various settlements along the St. Lawrence River, downstream from Quebec, as well as on the Quebec island of Ile de Lion, which is famous as being the breadbasket of Quebec. And if you've been there, you know why. It's just, it's amazing. By the 6th generation, Eugène Jandreau had moved to the upper St. John Valley, where in 1843 he married Marie-Louise Dominique. The marriage took place at St. Louis Parish Church in Frenchville, and that's what the church looks like today. I don't know how old this church is. Yes?
He was the first marriage to be performed in 1843 in St. Louis.
Oh, no
Yes,
kidding.
that's the first marriage.
That's when the parish
Yeah.
was established.
Okay.
Before that, it was a mission of San Rafael,
And is this the same
not
church?
the original church.
Is this a replacement church?
Yes, it is.
Lugiere and Lucy were recorded in the 1850 census again, Township 17, Range 9, now St. Francis, along with 4 children. Eugene, that's how it was recorded, in the 1860 census. The U.S. did an agricultural census every 10 years from about 1850 to 1880. This lists the livestock and produce on a farmstead for the previous year. And you can see, they had a lot of land, a decent amount of livestock, but also produced a tremendous amount of agricultural products. Now, there's no way that a family of a husband and a wife and 4 children ate 150 bushels of oats, or 150 bushels of potatoes. So this was largely a cashless economy. I mean, there wasn't a lot of hard currency around. Families were subsistence farmers, raised everything that they could for themselves, but banked on having a surplus of some commodities that they could either sell or barter. And a lot of stuff was done by barter. And you couldn't make metal farm implements unless you had scrap metal lying around. So there would be some things that you'd have to pay cash for. So clearly, this was a successful farming operation.
Excuse me, Dan.
Yes,
Where was this farm located again?
this what is now St. Francis.
It is.
My old homestead.
That's, okay, I'm trying to connect. Okay,
That's my homestead.
got it.
And finally, my grandmother's parents, Eugene Jandreau and Modeste Dubé, were married at Fort Kent in 1885. That's that. And that's the house in the back settlement at St. Francis that my grandmother grew up in. I don't know if that house is still there.
No, it isn't.
The memorial card for Modeste Dubé, who died in 1948 at the age of 86 from heart disease. And her husband, Eugene Jandreau, who died in 1952, the year I was born, at the age of 90, from pneumonia and influenza. And that is their gravestone at St. Francis. I'll close with a photograph that I will absolutely love. This was probably taken by my grandfather. That's my grandmother. He's missing from the photo. This was probably taken when my parents were married in 1951. That's my father. That's my mother. Most of these are sisters and brothers and spouses.
Yeah.
Is that your mother on the right? Her
Oh,
looks never changed.
she's right. That's Sylvia. Yeah.
Her looks never changed.
Right. And that's Ballman. Yeah.
Wow, it's a good picture.
Yeah.
So in addition to their Thibodeau and Jandreau family ancestries, my grandparents were descended from another 160 families, from Albert to Vallier. I will touch on a few of those families and talk about how they were all interconnected. And we start with my favorite family of all, Hebert. Louis Hebert was born in Paris in 1575. He became an apothecary. At the time, you didn't have a physician, you didn't go to a primary care physician. An apothecary was sort of a primary caretaker and pharmacist rolled in one. You go to him, describe your symptoms, you decide what was wrong, and you go in the back room, mix up a potion, and give it to him. In 1601, he married Marie Rollet, and they soon had 2 daughters. In 1604, Louis Hebert accompanied the French merchant and adventurer Pierre de Gaulle on an expedition to establish the first permanent French settlement in North America. Also on the expedition as captain and cartographer was Samuel de Champlain. Now most people think that the first settlement of the French in North America happened in Nova Scotia, or Acadia as we know it. It didn't. It happened on St. Croix Island, which is now in the boundaries of the state of Maine. Louis stayed for the first summer, went back to France with a load of furs, which was a good thing, because half the colonists, they were all men, half the colonists died that first winter on St. Croix Island because they didn't have enough food. The next summer, they moved everything, lock, stock, and barrel, to Port Royal in Acadia, now in Nova Scotia. This is a reproduction of the original habitation at Port Royal, which is operated by Parks Canada as the Port Royal National Historic Site. That's the external view, and there's an internal view. Louis Hebert came back and forth 2 or 3 times. He also accompanied Champlain in exploring the coast of what would become New England as far south as Cape Cod. At Port Royal, Louis experimented with planting various crops and consulted with the local Mi'kmaq people about indigenous medicinal herbs. Louis was at Port Royal in 1613 when the place was sacked by Scottish raiders from the Jamestown colony, who basically told all the French settlers to go back to France, which they did. And that would be the end of the story. You don't get much genealogy with only men in a colony that just got told to go back to France. Well, as I say, it would be the end of it, except in 1608, Champlain had founded what we now call Quebec City as a fur trading post. In the winter of 1616-1617, Champlain was back in France drumming up support for his new colony and looking for settlers. He reacquainted himself with Louis Hébert and said, "I want you to come to Quebec to be the colony's apothecary, and I want you to bring your family," which he did. In 1617, Louis Hébert and his family emigrated to Quebec, where his wife Marie was the only woman, the first family. Louis built the first stone house in the colony, was the first farmer, the first private citizen to own land in New France. And one of the things that was great for me about doing this book is I got to go to places that I'd never been to. One of them was Quebec City. If you stand with the river, if you're looking at the Chateau front of that, with the river behind you, you reach out your right arm, and you walk 2 blocks, there's a little triangular park. And there's a statue to Louis Hébert and his family.
That fellow to the left, that's Guillaume Couillard. That's my great-great-grandfather.
Okay. Louis is depicted here with a sheaf of grain in one hand and a sickle in the other. I'm descended from Louis through his son Guillaume, who married Hélène Despots, the godchild of Champlain's wife and the first known surviving child of French parents in North America. Prior to that, children had been born to a French father and a native mother. This was the first child born to a French father and a French mother. So when I started this journey into my mother's ancestry, I had 2 questions I wanted to answer. One was, how far back did my roots go in Maine? The answer is Louis Hébert on St. Croix Island, 1604, which is 3 years before Jamestown, and however many years before the Pilgrims at Plymouth Colony, which was 1620.
16.
And if you're interested in Quebec and you want to read only one book about the early days of colonial Quebec, this is the one to read, written by a descendant of Hélène Despots. And another historical tidbit, I'm sure some of you know, Samuel de Champlain, who was revered as the father of New France, died childless on Christmas Day in 1635. In his will, he left money and clothing to Hélène Despots. Next in this pantheon of early characters is Abraham Martin, nicknamed the Scot. He was the river pilot and friend of Champlain, who arrived at Quebec in 1619 with his wife. His wife and Pierre Despots' wife were sisters, so they came together. This is an imagined portrait of Abraham Martin that's in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. At his death, Champlain left money to Abraham Martin and his wife to be used to buy and clear land. Abraham was soon pasturing his livestock on a height of land adjacent to his own in the upper town of Quebec. Some of you know where this is going. That land is called the Plains of Abraham. This is an aerial view. The plains are famous as the site of the British victory over the French in 1759 during the last French-Indian War, which effectively ended French control of Canada. Plains of Abraham today is a national park, and there is a plaque at the park entrance to Abraham Martin. And my descent from Abraham is through his daughter Marie, who married Jean Cloutier. Jean Cloutier arrived at Quebec in 1634 with his siblings and his parents. His father was master carpenter Zachary Cloutier. Zachary was soon at work building a church and a fort for the colony at Quebec. And these are plaques to Zachary and his wife in their home parish in France. A lot of this information, especially from France, is from family genealogy websites that you find online. Zachary and his wife had 6 children born in France, one of whom died young. I'm descended from 4 of the 5 remaining children, all in bold. And multiple connections between families is not unusual. The most extensive example of this is the family of immigrant René Ouellette. René Ouellette was the son of a tax collector for the French government. He was in Quebec by 1664 and had 11 children by 2 wives. This is a memorial plaque that the family placed to René and his 2 wives. Between them, my grandparents have 7 lines of descent from René and his 2 wives. A little segue here. If you think about your genealogy and say, well, I've got 2 grandparents and 4 great-grandparents and 8 great-great-grandparents, and well, if you keep doubling at each generation and go back far enough, you'll have more ancestors than were living in Canada. You go back far enough, you have more ancestors than the number of people who ever lived. Well, obviously that can't be right, and it isn't. Because what you get are at various points what genealogists call genetic bottlenecks, where there are a very small native population that doesn't get a lot of new immigration for years. And by the time you get through 3 or 4 generations, everybody's related to everybody else. One of those places was Acadia, another was Quebec, another was Plymouth Colony, to a lesser extent Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that's how my grandparents wind up having 7 lines from René Ouellette. Some of these lines are short. This is the first one. That's number 2. Number 3. Now I'm getting to a line that goes through 6 generations. Number 4. Number 5 is René's through his second wife. Number 6. And number 7. René's first wife, Anne Ribe, is noteworthy because she was one of the so-called filles du roi.
Yep.
By the middle of the 17th century, Quebec was a thriving fur trading settlement, but wasn't yet a self-sustaining colony because there were very few women and very few families. To remedy the situation, between 1663 and 1673, King Louis XIV of France sent slightly more than 700 eligible young women to Quebec to provide wives for the single men of the colony. These women were mostly poor and many were orphaned. They became known by genealogists as the filles du roi, the king's daughters. They are, in many cases, the ancestral mothers of most Quebec families. In addition to paying for personal and moving expenses and for passage to New France, King Louis XIV provided each of the Thibodeaux with a dowry of essential items. Money, a small hope chest, a headdress, a taffeta handkerchief, a pair of shoe ribbons, 100 sewing needles, which they probably didn't need, a comb, a spool of white thread, a pair of stockings, a pair of scissors, 2 knives, 1,000 pins. If you're doing seamstress work, you need a lot of pins. A bonnet, 4 lace braids, and some silver money. When the Thibodeau married, she got more money, an ox, a cow, 2 pigs, a pair of chickens, and 2 barrels of salted meat. And if you're poor and an orphan living in France, this is a pretty good deal. There are a total of 24 Thibodeaux, who are ancestors of Daniel Thibodeau and or his wife, Rebecca Jandreau. The asterisk indicates where they were both descended from the same Thibodeau. And these are the years that those Thibodeau came. And you might ask, how do I know all that? That's because there's 2 books on the Thibodeau. And one of those Thibodeaux, Marie-Catherine de Bayonne, was one of 3 known immigrant ancestors of Daniel Thibodeau or his wife Rebecca Jandreau, with known lines of descent from Charlemagne, king of the Franks, who was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800. Charlemagne is all by himself one of these genetic bottlenecks. You need to remember that 400 years after he lived, Europe went through the Black Death. Roughly half the population died. So those who survived go back to a smaller, much smaller pool of people. We've already met a few immigrants who had trade or professional occupations. Pierre Thibodeau was a miller and a farmer. Louis Hébert was a pharmacist. Elaine Decour, after she had her children, became a midwife. Abraham Martin was a ship pilot. And Zachary Cloutier was a master carpenter. Other known occupations of immigrant ancestors of Daniel Thibodeau or Rebecca Jandreau include gunsmith, butcher, baker, wheelwright, shoemaker, master mason, fur trapper, the French word for which translates as runner of the woods, tailor or dressmaker, blacksmith, merchant, fisherman, and weaver. They were the exceptions. Most immigrants were farmers or small-scale merchants. And I have a few examples of them. Immigrants Jean and Pierre Gagnon were 2 of 3 brothers who came from a small village in the old French province of Perche in northwest France and became merchants in the settlement at Quebec. The Percheron draft horse is a native of the whole province of Perche. And that is a photograph of the ancestral Gagnon home, which still survives today. And that is a plaque to the brothers who operated the first general store in Quebec. And this is on the side of one of the buildings in the lower town. Another immigrant who was from northwest France was Guillaume Pelletier. He was a pioneer, a logger, a sawyer, a carpenter, and a coal merchant. That's the ancestral Pelletier home. And all this stuff is from family websites. Pierre Tremblay was a farmer, also from the same region of France. That's the ancestral home. Updated some, but it's still there. And finally, Jean Tridel was a linen weaver, again from the same part of France. And that's a pretty modest home. So the second question I had that I wanted to answer was, having done my father's ancestry, how many immigrant ancestors do I have? So I know the earliest, that was Louis Hebert. The latest was my Swedish great-grandparents, who immigrated to Sister Bay, Wisconsin in 1883. And the answer to how many immigrant ancestors I have. And mind you, this doesn't count all the duplicates. I mean, this is counting Renee Ouellette once, not 7 times. And astoundingly, I don't have any 20th century immigrants, and only 4 19th century immigrants, my Swedish ancestors moved to Sister Bay, Wisconsin. And that's the ethnicity of those 448 immigrants. I'm happy to answer questions. I do want to say that next to Patrick, there's a couple of maps. And the archives does have a great map of the Acadian diaspora at the end of the last French and Indian War. And there are a bunch of source books that you may or may not be familiar with that you can look through. So, ready? Questions?
Dan, early in your comments, you mentioned the family name Albert. And I may have missed where they fit into this family history. Was it?
So
Read the book?
Yeah, I didn't obviously go through 160 different
Family
families.
names. Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
So it's, yeah.
That isn't to say that they're not related. It's just that you highlighted.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yes?
Is it a mistake on my part that Catherine de Ballion was not an orphan? She was descended from someone of stature and...
Right. I'd have to look and see exactly what her ancestry was, but right. I can't remember if she was an orphan at the time, but yes, she had.
It was my understanding she wasn't.
Wasn't.
But,
Okay.
mean,
yeah. Most of them were, but they weren't all. Yeah. Well, good.
Can't
Thank you.
wait to get the book.
And there's right. And there's copies.
Can't wait to get the book.
You better have a lot of late nights. And keep going back.
So if there are no further questions, hopefully we can thank Mr. Murch for his presence here tonight. After a long drive to get up here. I'll just add a few more comments, and then if you want to approach Mr. Murch with additional questions or want to check out the maps, you're absolutely welcome to. By the way, his book is on sale here, so at the modest cost of $35. So I think it's, for 1,600 pages, very much worth it. And the amount of research he conducted here. I want to mention really quickly before we move on to that segment that we've had a really wonderful fall, having great events here on campus, organized partly by the Acadian Archives, including a Poetry Express. We had a concert a month ago by Robert Sylvain. This really adds to our cultural programming, so we're thankful to have a wonderful book talk by such an accomplished author as Mr. Murch. I also want to mention we have another event coming up to wrap up our fall season of cultural programming. That's going to come on December 3rd. We're going to have, that's Saturday morning, So make sure you book that. It's not a mistake if you see Saturday morning on our calendar. That's a community forum. So over the course of the summer, Madeline and I, Madeline being our archivist, who's in the nosebleed section back there. So we've been conducting oral interviews in the community to trace people's experience with the closed border, especially in our region where we have such a close relationship with our partners across the river and across the border. So we wanted to trace people's experience with that, especially during COVID and the border restrictions which I think many of us experienced living in this region. So we'll close up that process and we'll share our findings that we had through our oral interview process. And it's a community forum, so we want other people to speak up and share their experiences. So it's a good way of reflecting on the past, the present, where we are with the border today, and our hopes and aspirations for the future, if not our concerns as well. So it's going to be a great experience. We have wonderful guest speakers who are going to be there, again, December 3rd, including Professor Lisa Lavoie, who has written her thesis, her master's thesis, on the closed border and the impact of 9/11. Now this feels like a sequel in terms of the hardening of the border. And we also have Amber Rankin from our Chamber of Commerce here in Fort Kent. And we'll have a few other people. So it's a good way to hear from experts, of which I'm not, but we have people in the community who can speak with authority on this, and having your voices heard as well as we chronicle this segment. And all these oral interviews will be available here at the archives. They'll be stored here for future generations, and researchers want to learn more about our experience here of sometimes being separated from kin and from friends across the border. So again, December 3rd in the morning, and very soon we'll have advertising to come to accompany that announcement. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. So thank you again for being here. We love welcoming people into our space. I'll move my chair aside, so feel free to check out these resources, to check what's all around you. Again, thank you, Mr. Murch. Thank you, Don Raymond, for being here and taping this. And we hope you have a nice end to your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.